Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. We're going to be talking about the beloved, venerable Fulton Sheen today. I just read a new biography of him published by Ignatius Press by Cheryl C.D. Hughes, and the title is Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, Convert Maker. The subtitle indicates that while this is a full biography, it focuses in particular on a number of high-profile converts of his, as well as his methods of bringing people to the faith more generally. And I'm very happy to have the author, Cheryl Hughes, on the podcast with me. She holds a PhD in historical theology from Durham University in England. And she also wrote a very good biography of St. Catherine Drexel, which was one of the first professional book reviews I ever wrote about 10 years ago was of that book. So very happy to be talking to her. Cheryl, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here.
Okay, well, this book was a real pleasure to read, and it's very intelligent, it's very nuanced, and it gets into a lot of very interesting issues that I wouldn't have necessarily expected. But let me start off saying, what are some of your favorite episodes of Fulton Sheen's show, Life is Worth Living?
He has a very good one on nice people.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what he's saying there is that people who think that they are nice people often are not, that they often just sort of dismiss their sins and peccadillos as just, oh, well, that's just a little slip. I'm just fine. I'm a nice person after all. I've not murdered anybody anytime soon.
Mm.
And the people who know they're not nice people, know what their problems are, and then they're much more easily dealt with because they realize that they are far from God and they need help getting there. So that was a very interesting segment of Life is Worth Living.
Mm. Yeah, now I don't know if you've seen this one, but I haven't seen the full episode that it's from, and I'm not even sure which show it's from. I can't remember if it's the color TV show or the black and white TV show, but it's a clip that's gone around the internet in the past few years on false compassion. Have you seen that one?
I have not.
So it's very timely because he is very, very strongly denouncing this false compassion, where he says, it puts the I wish I could remember his exact terms because it's very strong language, but he basically says, it compassion for the criminal over the victim, compassion for the the freaks, the junkies, the homosexuals. I think he runs out this whole list of,
Yes.
people that the modern world has this false compassion for over, the victims of crimes or people who actually, should have compassion. And I mean, obviously I know he had compassion for sinners as such, but
For sure.
yeah, that's one that people have been passing around lately.
Well, he also had another one very similar to that on intolerance, that we are too tolerant of sinful behavior and deviations from what God has intended for us to be and how we are supposed to act. So I'm not surprised that he has one on false compassion as well.
Right. Now, you surely had a wealth of resources to research in when writing this book, right? Because there's just so much out there on him, written about him, written by him, broadcasts, all of that stuff.
I was very lucky to be able to use the positio.
Oh, yeah.
That's not always possible, but I really appreciate the Sheen Foundation for sharing that with me.
Explain to people what that is.
That is essentially it's the first document that's given to the cause for canonization in Rome, and it's a biography. It's got interviews with many people. It's there to sort of prove his holiness and his worthiness to have a cause just open for him.
Right.
And it's got a long Latin title, but we can just call it the positio.
Right.
It's their position that he is saint worthy.
So you were, I assume, able to get more testimony from people who met him and things like that from that.
Yes. Yeah, there was one in there that a fellow who had met him sometime in Iowa, and he said, looking at Bishop Sheen and looking him in the eyes was like looking into the eyes of God.
Hmm.
I don't know where else you would have gotten that except in the Positio.
Hmm.
It was just perfect.
Do we know with any certainty why the cause has been delayed?
Well, my understanding of it from the Sheen Foundation is that Rochester, where he was the ordinary, um, called a halt to it really at the last minute, with the suggestion that maybe he had not done everything he should have done vis-a-vis pedophilia priests. And so they looked into that. The Vatican looked into it. The Sheen Foundation looked into it. Rochester looked into it. There's nothing there. But unfortunately, it's been stalled now. And in the meantime, other causes for canonization are catching people's attention. And it really, what it takes is the USCCB to get behind it. I mean, I wish I were rich enough to send every bishop in the country a copy of the of my book to get them back on the stick for his canonization, because it certainly is past due. I mean, he actually already has a miracle.
Right.
So he's really ready for beatification.
Right. Yeah, it would be nice. I mean, many people have observed we still don't have a native-born male American saint.
That's
we
right.
have a blessed, maybe more than one, but
Right.
not a full saint yet. So,
No.
yes, that would be great. One of the things, there's a few topics from your book that particularly stuck out to me that I want to discuss. But one of them, which I didn't really expect, is your analysis of his showmanship and his rhetorical methods, and there's even a paragraph or two breaking down the cinematography of his TV show, which was I really enjoyed that and I appreciated that. So what can we say about his kind of rhetorical methods in terms of his public persona and how he preached, so to speak, on his show?
His debate coach in college told him very early on to be natural. And I think he, above all things, was natural. And the sense of, especially on television, people got the sense that he was in their living room, if you will. I mean, he could be sitting down with a TV tray on his lap eating dinner out of it, TV dinner. So his main style was to find common ground on something we can all sort of agree with. And so he would take that familiar and then take it to something that was much more spiritual, much more profound, much more impactful in people's lives. So, I mean, he would talk even about nuclear fission on television. That's not something that we talk about around the dinner table at night, but he was able to make a whole show out of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I remember there was a bit about how he prepared for each episode of the TV show. I think it was the TV show anyway.
Yeah.
It was like he spent 30 hours prepping for each episode, something like that.
Hours and hours and hours. He wrote outlines and would tear them up and throw them away, and he'd write another one, another one, another one. Finally, he would sort of give it to a French speaker and then also to an Italian speaker to read, just to see how it went in those languages. And then he tore everything up. So he didn't memorize it all. He mastered the material.
Right.
So that even if he forgot one thing that he thought he wanted to say, there were a million other things in his brain that would be equally as effective.
Right.
And so he just mastered that material in a way that, you don't see actors doing. He was not an actor. He was not an entertainer. He was preaching or teaching or speaking from his heart every time.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the book it said he actually gave the lecture in French and in Italian to his
Yes,
people in his office who spoke those languages, just to
right,
make sure he knew it every which way, which is
right.
fascinating. There were also earlier in the book something about like his 3 rules for lecturing or something. What were those?
Oh, let's see.
I know one. I remember the third one was don't ever lecture from a sitting position
That's
because
right.
fire is
Stand up.
not kindled sitting down.
Um,
Um,
well, one of the rules is that you shouldn't use notes, and he should tear his notes up every time.
oh,
But
that's right. Yeah, that you shouldn't give the same lecture a
never
million
gave the
times.
same
Yeah,
lecture twice.
which is great.
But also in there somewhere, he also says one of the rules for public speaking is to have a good beginning and a good end, and a short distance between the two.
Can you
So
talk? Yeah, right. I remember that. Can you talk a bit about the cultural power that this guy had, the kind of audience he had, even outside of Catholics?
Catholics were not even the majority of his television audience.
Wow.
They probably were the majority of his radio audience, but by the time he went on television, it was something that would be um, aimed at a public that was conversant with Christianity, but not necessarily even Christian, because they were Jews who were very uh, influenced by his works.
Hmm. Wow. That's so fascinating. Yeah. It seems like he came at like a perfect time in American culture and in the Catholic Church's position in American culture, kind of at the height of the church's mainstream influence, I guess, in
Hmm.
American culture, which may have been, I don't know, the 30s through the early 60s or something like that. Um,
Well, not yet. Really, I think Catholics don't hit mainstream until after World War II.
okay.
You know,
I
one
only
of
said the 30s because of the influence on Hollywood, the production code and stuff like that.
oh, for sure,
Yeah.
we had
But maybe
that.
that was more behind the scenes.
Right, right. You know, there still was an awful lot of anti-Catholicism in the 30s and the 40s.
Hmm.
I mean, when there was um, an ambassador sent to Rome, to the Vatican, I mean, people just had a fit. I mean,
Wow.
they really were up in arms about
And
that.
when
Thought
did
that
that
was
happen?
terrible. Before the war,
Okay.
between World War One and World War Two.
Wow. Fascinating. Yeah, but he came, into prominence in this era. And another fascinating thing is, the middle brow television that existed at that time. I mean, I've observed, even going back and watching things from the like talk shows from the 70s, for instance, it was a different kind of conversation, a different kind of attention span. If you go back, I can't remember all the people's names, but if you go back and watch an episode of Dick Cavett or something like that, and you see, they would have, all kinds of people on. They would have philosophers, they would have classical musicians,
Mm.
um, not that I love Ayn Rand, but Ayn Rand would go on these shows, and you had Buckley, and you had Leonard Bernstein doing like serious symphonic music for a general audience, and you had jazz, and you had all of this. That was a great era of middle brow American culture where there was still a way to get higher culture to the masses, or at least kind of the middle classes. And likewise, somebody with the intellectual heft and the eloquence of Bishop Sheen, his talents were not wasted in that era. It was like a perfect time for him to be on TV.
I think they talk about the perfect storm. This was the perfect time for him to be on television. It was the infancy of television. And one of the things you can
Mm,
see today, and you talk about even looking at the 70s, there's a big difference between the 50s and the 70s
mm,
in the way television looks and the way people acted on television. Very early on, they still were in the sort of the stage play,
right, the
uh,
teleplays. Yeah.
that so they made large gestures, and would get their face right up to it, because they're still talking to the person in the back row, way back there in the theater. And by the time you get to the 70s, and certainly now, that's not true anymore. We expect kind of movie quality entertainment with high production values and what have you. And his production values were just fine, but they were minimal to say the least. He had a stage, he had a statue of the Virgin Mary, and we called the Our Lady of Television. There was a cross on the wall, but not a crucifix. So there was no corpus on it. I think that was to preserve, not to ruffle the feathers of our Protestant brothers and sisters. He had his blackboard that he wrote on, but that's really all it was. It was just a guy in a skirt talking. That I don't think that would go today. And even the way he talked was so dramatic.
Yes.
It's a change of taste and values, aesthetic values.
Yeah.
The problems were all the same. And that's one thing I really enjoyed about him, was how prescient he was. And he picked up on issues and difficulties in society that, transcend time.
Yeah. So given the wide religious background of his various viewers, how did he conceive the purpose of that show? Was it for evangelization? Was it for something else?
Everything he did was for evangelization, but that was not the main reason. The main reason
of Life is Worth Living specifically.
Of Life is Worth Living specifically was that the Catholic Church in New York City, Archbishop Spellman, Cardinal Spellman, wanted to help make Catholicism less alien and more American. It wasn't to Americanize the church, but to let the wider audience see that the church was not a dangerous, subversive organization. Even when John Kennedy was running for president, there was talks about the Pope coming and putting the Vatican in the Mississippi Valley. It was just bizarre things. So there still was that anti-Catholicism, even though in both World War I and World War II, Catholics made up of 35% of the fighting forces. And their percentage of the population was, a fraction of that.
Wow, interesting.
So once World War II was over and you get into the 50s, and Catholics are starting to move into the suburbs, they're getting away from the inner cities, from their very parochial, national kinds of churches. All the immigrants that came, the Germans would have a German-speaking Catholic church, and the Poles would have Polish, and but it was starting to be, we were, as Catholics, beginning to blend more and more into the Catholic, into the general population. So that was really important to. That's why it wasn't so doctrinal. Life is Worth Living was very general, morality, public issues. It was not the Assumption of Mary into heaven or the perpetual virginity of Mary. He wouldn't go there. In fact, when he talked about Mary at all, he talked about her as a mother. So, and he didn't really talk about the Pope. So, it was meant for a wide audience.
On the other hand, he wore his full regalia as a bishop on the show.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. He said that when they were starting the show, he asked around, what should I wear? And it was recommended they just wear the clerical suit with the Roman collar. But he said, when I speak to audiences, I always wear my, full regalia. And so he did. But I think one of the reasons behind that full regalia is it's so impressive, to say the least. It's very impressive. the man was all of 5'7", I believe, maybe
Hmm.
5'8" on a very proud day.
Hmm.
But with that regalia and the way it just made him look larger,
Hmm.
more impressive. The camera angles were a little bit below him, looking up at him, making him look taller than he actually was.
Right. Yeah.
All those things. But I think the regalia was very important because I think it stated bluntly who he was and what he was about.
Right. Yeah. That's true. Okay, so the book is in large part about his convert making, and the most inspiring thing for me about the book was just to see all the examples of how direct he was in evangelizing. Because I think now we feel like we have to be so indirect and we have to be so timid and kind of tiptoe our way into it, and we have to do all this apologetics, and which of course he was perfectly capable of doing. And we should, start with natural law and then, not get into the supernatural stuff too quickly and all that stuff. But he would say, be in a conversation, he would say, let's now talk about your soul. Or in the case of Louis Boudin's, they're having who is a communist, they're having this conversation about communism and Soviet policies and stuff. And suddenly he just says, let us now talk of the Blessed Virgin. So can you talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit? Just his way of confronting things in a very direct but somehow winsome way.
It's shocking in a way that he did those things. He would say, "Let us talk about your soul. Let's talk about one thing or another." I think the most remarkable story on that level is when he met Claire Booth Luce for the first time. Now, for people who don't know who she was married to Henry Luce, who owned Time magazine and all the other ancillary magazines that they had, as well as some television outlets. Very wealthy, very sort of erudite and highly, highly intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
And the poor woman, her mother had died, her mother's boyfriend had died, and he had actually been like a stepfather to Claire and her brother. Then, unfortunately, her daughter, Claire Booth Luce's daughter, died in a car accident, which has got to be the worst thing that any mother could wake up to. And they say, I'm sorry, your daughter had a car accident. She was in college, driving down from San Francisco, where she and her mother had spent a couple of days together. So Claire was at loose ends. At this time, she's a congresswoman from Connecticut, and she gets deeper and deeper and deeper into depression. And one night, she is in a hotel room in New York City, and she's thinking about jumping over the side because that's what 3 of her friends had done. And we all know that suicide can be catching. So by the grace of God, she, instead of jumping over, after contemplating it for a while, she called a priest who had been sending her letters at her congressional office. He was never asking for money or anything. He was just sort of saying things like, God bless you, thank you for everything you do, that sort of thing. And he got called at 2 a.m, and she apologized, and he said, "Oh, no, no, no." He said, "We have been praying for this call. We have been praying for this call. I know you're very sad in a low point, and the person who can help you is Fulton Sheen." And so this kind priest from, I believe he was from Ohio or Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest, called Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen called her up and invited her to dinner at his house. He had a chef, so, and a chaperone. It was all quite up and up. And he said, I'll talk for 5 minutes, and then you can talk for however long you want to talk. So somewhere in the first 5 minutes, he referenced the goodness of God. And Claire Booth Luce jumped out of her chair and said, goodness, your God is not good. Look what he's done. Why did he take my child? If he's good, he wouldn't have taken my child. And Bishop Sheen said, and this is extremely blunt, that her death was the price for your redemption. I can almost not say that because it's just such a poignant moment, I think. And she said she knew in that moment that this was the person who was going to bring her into the Catholic Church.
Mm.
And so she was on board with it after that. But that is the baldest uh,
Yeah.
conversion
Yeah.
story that I've ever heard, I think.
Yeah. Another great one is when he goes, I think he goes to visit a woman whose husband had wanted to commit suicide or something,
Oh,
but they're
yeah.
not at home. And so he goes to the apartment building and he says, well, as long as I'm here, let me see who else lives here. And so he knocks on the door across the hall and finds out that this composer, Fritz Kreisler, and his wife, is that his name, Kreisler?
Chrysler, yes.
And his wife live there. And he just sits down and starts talking to them and asks them if they're interested in, being what's the term? Not RCIA, but something along
Would
those
they like
lines.
instruction,
Yeah, were
or
they
would
like
be
instruction
interested in
instruction
joining
in
the
the faith?
Catholic Church?
And they
Yeah,
said yes. So, you just never know.
that's a big, big surprise. Or the stewardess that was on a plane that he was in flying back from Asia after he had been to the leper colony over there. And he just couldn't get over the leper colony. And he was so thrilled. At first, he was horrified at the lepers, their terrible disfigurement and what have you. And he was passing out rosaries and blessings, and he would drop the rosary beads from on high into their hands because he didn't want to touch them. And then he suddenly saw in them the face of Christ. And then he took their hands and he held them and he kissed them and he gave them the rosaries and blessed them. And this was a very moving experience for him. And he was sharing it with the stewardess on the way back. And a couple of months later, who should knock on the door but the stewardess wanted to talk to Fulton Sheen to tell him she was leaving the airlines and she was joining a convent to become a missionary sister in Asia.
Wow.
I
Wow.
mean, if you sit next to him and you're not Catholic at the end of the trip, something's gone wrong.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's just inspiring, that kind of boldness in the Holy Spirit. I mean, I don't know that we can all just sort of make a decision to be exactly like he was, because it takes holiness. It takes you have to know when the Spirit is guiding you. You have to be docile and all of that. But it just seems like something that we could all learn from today is that, not to pick on anybody in particular, but some people were complaining that at the inauguration yesterday, as we're recording this, Cardinal Dolan, or no, 2 days ago, Cardinal Dolan did not mention the name of Christ in his opening prayer, whereas the Protestant Franklin Graham did. And so I don't know, that is something we should be seriously considering, is, that kind of directness, as St. Paul says, like, preaching Jesus Christ and him crucified, instead of
Right.
only relying on all the intellectual stuff or just being timid in general. Yeah. So that was the chief thing I got out of the book, actually.
Well, one of the other converts was Bricktop.
Right.
Her name was Ada, and she had a whole bunch of names: Ada, Beatrice, Queen Victoria, Smith.
Uh-huh.
And she had her mother was a woman who had been born into slavery. And so Ada is born around really close to Sheen, towards the end of the 19th century. And she never did have instructions from Sheen. She was a nightclub owner and an entertainer.
Right.
She was very big in Paris between the two world wars. All of the American expatriates that were there went to her. She kept a table just for Cole Porter, who wrote her a song that became her signature song. But she came home as the Nazis were getting ready to roll into Paris. And so she came back to the United States, and there was a terrible color barrier here that she hadn't experienced over in Europe. It just,
Mm.
the color barrier was insurmountable. And so she found that she was really in the depths of her despair, and she met a friend or somebody who had worked with her before who had just been a terrible person, but now was very loving and open. And so she said to him, "Well, what happened to you? I mean, what happened to you?" And he said, "Well, I became a Catholic." And she said, "What does that have to do with anything?" He said, "Well, you should listen to Bishop Sheen." So she started listening to him on the radio, and it made so much sense to her that she ultimately converted, but she didn't go to Sheen to convert her. He gave her kind of the intellectual stuff that she needed, and then she
Mm.
went to her local priest.
Right.
And that's amazing to me. We had a talk here in town, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago by Patrick Coffin, and he mentioned that he had been converted through radio,
Mm.
Catholic radio.
Right.
So I think we can't dismiss the power of the medium.
Right. Yeah. And a number of the figures he focused on were communists. I mentioned Louis Boudin's. That story is quite interesting as well.
Yes, Louis Boudin's. It took him about 8 years to finally convert, because he was so convinced of the message of communism. And he also thought that communism in the United States wouldn't be like communism was in Russia.
Hmm.
He thought it would be a kinder, gentler kind of communism. And it took him quite a while to realize that the Communist Party here was being run out of Moscow. And
Right.
they really intended the destruction of the church.
Hmm.
And he just couldn't believe that. I guess he was blind. He was intellectually blind. He had been an altar boy. His family was very faithful. His growing up family was very faithful to the church. His father put flowers on the Virgin's altar every year. So Boudin's became the editor of the Catholic Worker.
Daily Worker, you
The
mean?
Daily Worker, thank
Yeah.
you. The Daily Worker. And he was also in the Central Committee. He was very influential. And he wrote a big piece on communism in his newspaper, and Bishop Sheen responded point by point by point, refuting everything that he had to say. And so he wanted to publish the refutation in the Daily Worker, but the Central Committee wouldn't allow him.
Right.
And somehow they managed to get together. Sheen and Boudin's got together, and they met. And he's the one who said, "Now let's talk about the Virgin Mary."
Right.
After supper or whatever. And he just couldn't leave communism. And so several years later, it really finally smacked him in the head that communism was out to destroy the United States and to destroy the Catholic Church. They viewed the Catholic Church as their main stumbling block to
Right.
dominion.
Because there was a period there when he was sort of attracted to coming back to the church, but he kind of wanted to try to get some kind of common ground between communism and the church or something.
Yes. I mean, it was false hope.
Right.
It was obviously false hope. And it had to really hit Boudin's in the face before he was willing to do that. For him, coming into the church just meant going to confession.
Right.
Because he was a baptized, confirmed Catholic.
Right.
His wife was not. And so, and he had 3 daughters. When they decided to come into the church, they all were going to convert together. And then Sheen bundled them out of town after the ceremony and sent them to Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, where Boudin's taught economics for a while before going on to Seton Hall and various other Catholic colleges. I don't know who he thought these people were. He said these people with very sort of English sounding names like James and Robinson and Jones. They all had very English sounding names, but they had these really heavy Eastern European accents. And they had been sent over from Moscow to kind of keep the American Communist Party on its toes. And we also have to remember the Communist Party was legal. Wasn't illegal to belong to the Communist Party. It was legal.
Right. Okay. Yeah. A lot of fascinating stories. I wanted to go on to, well, can you say actually a little bit about his critique of psychoanalysis? I found that very interesting. Very relevant still.
He affirmed his belief in psychology, but he was very opposed to Freudian psychoanalysis because it was so atheistic. And by his estimation, really what people needed was forgiveness from their sins.
Right.
And you would never hear a psychotherapist forgiving your sins because they don't. They don't have that power. But a priest does. And he thought that they were leading people astray by, and taking all their money because it was very expensive. And he did make a kind of a snide comment that the psychoanalysts were very quick to take on wealthy, good-looking young women, but not so much for other types. So, I mean, he was really, really down on psychoanalysis, and a bunch of therapists actually resigned from Catholic hospitals because they thought that was the Catholic line. But he was very quick to say, what we need here is Peace of Soul, which is one of his main books. Peace of Soul is a beautiful book. And Peace of Soul is what the church can give you, what Christ can give you, not what the psychoanalysis can give you.
Yeah. So he did say he believed in some study of psychiatry and psychology, but specifically the Freudian model was what he was critiquing. But also more generally, I think it does apply to this idea that what we need is talk therapy, and only that, or that is what's going to save us, as opposed to going to confession, having a prayer life, examining yourself for self-knowledge and repentance, rather than just simply for in a kind of a discovering your psychological mechanisms, which is not the same as growing closer to God or repenting from your sins. It might give you some kind of insight into how your mind works, but it stays on a kind of a surface functional level.
Right. And it allows people to blame some of their actions on other things that they claim not to be in control of.
Right.
So it lets them off the hook.
Yeah. Okay. One of the really interesting bits of the book, and this does pertain to his canonization, is this kind of ongoing struggle with vanity and ambition, which you are very frank about. This is something that he had a lifelong kind of vanity that he admitted in his autobiography, which was written very late in his life. That he sort of repented of some of these things. So can you give me just like a complete overview of where that is, going from his young life, his time as a student, praying every day that he would become a bishop someday, and things like that.
He definitely wanted to become a bishop from an early age, but not as a little boy, but from a very early age he had wanted to be a priest. He was a pretty child. And he was a smart little boy. And pretty smart little boys get patted on the head quite a bit. So, he would be the valedictorian. He'd be the first in his class. He would get this. He would get that award. And I think he sort of took those as his due. But when Cardinal Spellman invited him to go to Asia with him, he realized that Americans are incredibly privileged and wealthy compared to the world's poor, the third world's poor. Those lepers in the Philippines, those really beggar children in India, all that brought home to him how privileged America was, and especially how privileged he was. I will say that he tried to empty himself in many ways. His was kind of a kenotic spirituality where he hardly ate anything. So what do you give? Alms, praying, and what's the third thing?
Fasting.
Penance.
Yeah.
And so he led a very penitential life. He hardly ate anything. And all this was to control his own vanity. I mean, he did admit that when he became a bishop, oh my gosh, this was wonderful. People were kissing my ring, and they were giving me special deference. But then he
liked the clothes. He liked the
he liked the limousine.
Yeah.
He liked all of that, and yet he was aware that that wasn't reality for him. One of the things he said is that if you're believe in the Holy Spirit and you believe in life after death, you know that how do I want to phrase this? What happens here is not that important. You are not that important, except as a child of God. That's where your importance lies, as a child of God. And Sheen, I think, was very aware of his shortcomings. Eventually, he started wearing a hair shirt. You mentioned his autobiography. It's called Treasures in Clay. He said that God didn't call angels to be priests. He called men. And particularly, he felt he was standing on feet of clay because everything, it was just on the tightrope between heaven and earth.
Right.
It was, and he did the holy hour every day. He started that when he was in seminary, after having had what he thought of as a mystical moment. Something happened. He was in the middle of a class, and suddenly there was some infusion into his intellect, a warm light. He couldn't really describe the warm light. It was on the inside of him, going out. He has no idea how long this experience lasted, but when he sort of came to, the class was being dismissed. So, a good part of an hour, maybe, who knows, if other people realized he was undergoing a spiritual conversion of his own. But after that, he kept the holy hour every day of his life. He one time was so intent on doing a holy hour that he was between flights. He's been, flying here, there, and everywhere. And so he decided that he would go into this church here between flights and he'd have the holy hour. Well, he was so exhausted he fell asleep. And he said, then he woke up exactly on the hour. And he said, well, I guess I did my holy hour.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
So he empties himself of many things, but then he fills himself up with Jesus in the Eucharist.
Right.
So it's emptying and filling at the same time, and kind of not unlike Catherine Drexel that you referenced early on.
Yeah. So he had very little, almost no pastoral experience as a parish priest. He actually, we haven't really, and we won't have time to talk about this. A lot of his work, aside from media, was with the missions.
Yes.
Right. What was the organization that he was in charge
of?
It
was the Society for the Propagation of the Faith.
Yeah,
it's their foreign missions. He was the American director of that, which meant he was a fundraiser.
Yes. And he did a great job with that and was very generous with money and gave his income away, we should mention, from, his radio and television shows. But what I wanted to bring up was, so he didn't have normal pastoral experience, but eventually, he becomes a bishop, and then finally, eventually, he's given the Diocese of Rochester in upstate New York. And so how did that go?
Not well. So there are people who think that his appointment to Rochester was Bishop Spellman's revenge. They had had a tiff earlier on over money. But you're right. He had only been as a associate pastor for about 8 months, very early on, when he was still in his 20s. Other than that, he was a university professor on the radio, on the television, what we think of. But he tried to do things too quickly. He really believed in Vatican II, and he wanted to implement them. He wanted to make Rochester a sort of a microcosm for the good things in Vatican II. His problem was that he was not much into dialogue. As the director of the propagation of the faith in the United States, he, told people what to do, and they carried it out. So he did not really collaborate as he said he was going to. He actually founded a committee for the seminary there in the diocese, and it had men and women on it. After the first meeting, he never invited the women back, and after the second meeting, he canceled the committee altogether. He didn't want people telling him what to do. And really his biggest downfall was when he decided to give away an inner city church that had a school attached to it. Very, very few people attended this. It was dying on the vine. And so he thought we needed housing for the poor. Seems like we've not gone very far, have we? At any rate, so he got in touch with the federal government and said, how about if if the Diocese of Rochester can gift the United States with land on which to build housing for the poor. Well, he forgot to tell the pastor, and the pastor told the people, and you can imagine what it was like. People were pelting his car and screaming at him, and I mean, it was just awful for him. He just felt crushed. Though the irony is that church did in fact get closed down a couple of years later, and Sheen used his own money and some fundraising techniques to start a foundation for poor housing there. He actually built one family a house out of his pocket money. And then today there's a Sheen housing foundation in Rochester. It's still going.
So all this stuff leads him to resign as Bishop of Rochester.
Well, he was over 75, so it was okay for him to resign. But he was there, less than 3 years, I think.
I'd like to close by talking a bit about his relationship with Cardinal Spellman, because it's there that I think we see Fulton Sheen's humility, in contrast to maybe some of his struggles with vanity and things like that.
Right.
So can you talk about the history of their relationship?
Sure. Well,
Spellman was also a giant titanic figure, in the American church.
Two big egos in New York City, clashing up against one another. It was Spellman who engineered his appointment to the Society for Propagation of the Faith.
Right.
And they got along quite well for quite a while. And then there were two things. There was a squabble over money. After World War II, the Protestant churches were expending great resources in helping to rebuild Europe. And Spellman wanted to use the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, wanted to use those funds and Sheen would not release the funds to him. He said, "No, these are for the foreign missions. People gave this for the foreign mission. This is not for the rebuilding of Europe after the war." And Spellman was furious. He's not used to being told no, and
Right.
so he sent Joe Kennedy to talk to him, President Kennedy's father, to talk to him.
Right.
All kinds of priests came by to talk to him. You know, give him the money, give him the money, give him the money. He
Right.
said, "No, it's not for that purpose." And so eventually it went to the Holy Father, and the Holy Father sided with Sheen, much to the embarrassment of the cardinal. And a short while later, Cardinal Spellman wanted the society to pay for powdered milk that it turned out that the federal government was giving to the society to give away to children.
Mm-hmm.
So we, the Catholics, the church didn't pay any money for it. It was
Mm-hmm.
given gratis by the federal government. It was
Right.
surplus food. So once again, Spellman was foiled, and once again, the Holy Father sided with.
And didn't he actually lie? Didn't Spellman actually lie about Sheen in that instance?
He did. But fortunately for Sheen, he's not usually a very good keeper of papers, but he was able to find an invoice that said 0.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very, it was infuriating, but I think you said it also touches his humility. He never talked about it. Only people close to him really knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Spellman, when he came up to Rochester for his installation as the bishop there, stayed, gave remarks, and left immediately. Didn't really stay for lunch. It was just the bare bones of what would have to do.
Right.
And yet, when the cardinal died, it was Spellman. I mean, it was Sheen who. I'm sorry, not died. It was when he had his anniversary. Sheen did all the planning for his anniversary. I mean, why would you think somebody who might not like you
Mm-hmm.
should be in charge of something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it was a fraught relationship.
Right.
After that,
and Sheen, not only out of personal humility, was quiet about it, but also because he did out of love for the church. Not wanting to make a public squabble.
Right. Exactly. The church is a big family, and you don't air your dirty linen in public.
Right.
Though that didn't hold for Spellman. Spellman, told a group of seminarians, "Don't you ever be like Bishop Sheen. He's the worst priest. Don't you ever be like him." That's pretty mean.
Yeah.
Pretty low.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting too, because it's not like this is like a liberal cardinal versus the conservative, Orthodox Sheen or something. Spellman was this like ultra conservative, figure.
Right.
Super anti-communist, everything else.
Well, I think he thought that because the Protestant churches were so big into rebuilding Europe that we would lose them from the Catholic Church.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting to learn about some of the corruption in the archdiocese too under Spellman, after the fact, like with the film on the waterfront, that the story the real story that's based on, it was like, I think I understand it was Spellman's right-hand man was, very involved in all the corrupt stuff happening down there with the dock workers and the mob and everything. So,
well, that's one of the reasons why there was so much anti-Catholicism. When, especially when the big cities had machine government run by Catholics largely. I think when the majority see the minority getting flexing its muscles, it gets a little nervous.
Right. Is there anything else you'd like to say about Fulton Sheen?
Oh, pray for his canonization. It's really way overdue. I'll tell you, his miracle was a baby born, stillborn, who did not breathe for over an hour.
Right.
And the doctors, just walked out of the delivery room and left the baby there. And after an hour, it started crying. And the doctors looked at it and said, well, it's not going to live very long. Couldn't possibly live very long. And it lived, or he lived. It was a little boy. And then they said, well, he's going to be multiply handicapped, and he's not at all. So that is his presenting miracle.
Right. Great.
So.
Right. All right. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much for doing this interview.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I hope people go out and get the book from Ignatius Press.
Great. Yes. So again, the book is titled Archbishop Fulton Sheen, Convert Maker. I'll link to that in the show notes, and also to my review of Cheryl's biography of St. Catherine Drexel from a decade ago or so. And so for all the listeners, if you'd like to follow everything else we're doing at catholicculture.org, I recommend you go to the website, catholicculture.org/newsletter, and sign up for our bi-weekly Insights email newsletter, which will keep you up to date with all of our commentary, the most important news stories twice a week, and also, any new articles, our other podcasts that we put out. All right, everybody, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of catholicculture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at catholicculture.org.